This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
This is a session on motherhood and memory, and we're going to keep introductions very brief, and we'll save the discussion for the end. And so our first speaker today is Federica Clementi, who is Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of South Carolina, soon to be Associate Professor, and also Interim Director of the Jewish Studies Program at the University of South Carolina, and author of an imminently forthcoming book titled Holocaust Mothers and Daughters, Family, History, and Trauma. And Federica's talk today is titled, Remember What Amalek Did to Her, Daughters Inscribing the Forgotten Mother into the Jewish Story.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a great conference. I'm really happy. It's a real, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. So I've been working for years on the issue of the representation of the Jewish mother in our culture. And in particular, my recent work is on focuses on the representation of the war mother, the Holocaust mother. And I kind of, I look at a huge bibliography, a huge number of texts, but instead of giving you summaries here and going into details of the text and the single stories, I work on your memoirs and autobiographies, life stories. But it would be impossible to talk about each author in each case here. So I decided to talk about the broader implications of my research, and in particular, the answer I came up with to my initial question: what does it matter? Why does it matter to attend to the writing of women in relation to the history of Shoah, which is a better word for Holocaust, for the Holocaust? So there is no lack of material regarding the Jewish mother, the stereotype, the myth, the fiction. She's the unbearable kvetcher, right? The chronic smothering over a protective complainer, which is of course the staple of Jewish humor from Eastern Europe to West Hollywood, or the epitome of female sainthood. So kind of, the representation of this lost, irrecoverable past, the Yiddishkeit of the Städtler. But all of it is a product of male imagination, and it appears that mostly in Jewish men's works, the Jewish mother remains either portrayed stereotypically or not portrayed at all. But of course this is fiction, music, film. So how about history, right? How about the actual mother in wartime and in memoirs and in autobiographies? And this is where my work begins. Can we talk about the Jewish mother the same way, say, Philip Roth or Woody Allen would, when we're talking about a mother who went through or died in a concentration camp? Spoiler alert, male history traditionally avoids women because of this. So the inability or unwillingness of many Jewish men writers to include women as more complex characters on the stage of life has spilled over even into the way they often represent or omit women in the reconstructions of Shoah memoirs. When we look at the canon of Holocaust autobiographies by men, when we read, the works, there is no description really of their mothers, very little of women, none of family life. For instance, in Primo Levi, nothing. It's as if he had no family. Elie Wiesel, another canonic writer, describes an almost mystical landscape of goodness and righteousness, where the mother, she appears 3 times. She has no dialogue. She doesn't speak, but she cooks and sings by the stove, even when the Nazis actually break into their house to arrest everybody. And of course, Spiegelman's Mouse, where the mother is absolutely done away with. So the widespread tendency of Shoah literature is either to strongly stylize the portraits of the victims or limit the treatment of their trials to the bare minimum. Particularly the early works, those published in the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, which is before feminism, really kind of allowed men to rethink their modes of writing, before feminists, I believe, made it possible for a Spiegelman to exist. So domestic conflict was often downplayed and denied or removed in order to keep the narrative focused exclusively on the apodictic distinction between good and evil, between victims and victimizers. As Anne Karpf pointedly said, I'm quoting, "It's hard to speak about Holocaust survivors in anything but a reverent tone or without turning their suffering into a sacrament," end quote. So characters in Shoah memoirs then risk remaining one-dimensional. Their status of victims eclipses their complex and multifaceted identities. This way of understanding victimhood is the heritage of millennia-long culture that elevates all martyrs to the status of saints, and therefore implicitly makes saints the object of martyrdom. So I find it crucial, and this I'm digressing for a second, to elaborate in my classrooms on the perniciousness, the danger of this kind of logic. And I always have to kind of remind my students that genocide is wrong, even if it happens to people you don't like. So in contrast to these idealizing tendencies, I work on many texts by female Shoah non-fiction writers who place the mothers, an unbearable and unlikable mother, and their domestic world at the very core of their texts. These mothers are ushered onto the historical scene as simultaneously heroic and unbearable, victims and victimizers of the daughters, half-crazed women and life-saving forces, their daughters' inexorable nemesis, but also the origin and raison d'etre of their art and writing. So what I attempted to make visible is the courageous act of portraying the complex, ambiguous, and sometimes unbearable side of a girl's love for her mother, and vice versa, under the extreme circumstances of genocide. The mothers these daughters talk to and about are difficult, oppressive, mean, resentful mothers, but they're also visible mothers. I mean, they're there, something that doesn't happen in male literature. Since most, but not all, of the daughters I deal with in my work were children during the war, and most of them survived. They actually wrote after 1968, so they really were into this kind of postmodern feminist mode of thinking and constructing memory. And some of the recognizable names, so that you kind of know whom I'm thinking of as I'm talking, is Austrian-born Ruth Kluger, French philosopher Sarah Kaufmann, Hungarian-born but Italian writer Edith Brooke and Elena Janecek, Milena Roth from the Kindertransport, and of course Anne Frank and Charlotte Solomon and others that died in the Holocaust. So if you have read any of these, including Anne Frank, then you know exactly how bad their mothers come out of their daughters' pens. And I'm interested only in women that write, that speak bad of their mothers, because I think that they do something really revolutionary with great ethical, positive implications. Women memoirists resist the temptation to paint an elegiac portrait of their mothers and families. They remember their anger, the injustices they suffered because they were girls and not boys when they were children. They make clear that Shoah did not allow for a pause or an exception to the psychic script that demands the mother-daughter story end in conflict. The script allows for the symbolic order to stand unchallenged by ensuring conflict among women and the misrecognition or rejection of one's maternal origins, what Amber Jacobs has described as the uninstitutionalized law of matricide. Although patricide is legislated and very present in the mind via the Oedipus complex, the failure to acknowledge the disappearance or the murder of the mother causes the story of women to be constantly retold within the frame of the father's discourse, a frame that forecloses the daughter's loyalty to her female kin and her self-recognition as a mother's daughter. Jacob writes, and I'm quoting, "The daughter is cut off from the maternal origin. So long as there is no possibility of giving symbolic expression to the mother-daughter relation, the latter will inevitably remain an area of pathology," end quote. So despite the Shoah, the pathological mother-daughter relation is manifested without exception in the experiences of the daughters I studied. However, I claim that by placing the normality of this conflictual relation at center stage, even in the midst of the utter abnormality of the war, these daughters end up exposing the fact that they, like their mothers before them, are limited by the patriarchal frame in what they can represent and how they understand their own history as women. The patriarchal symbolic configuration in psychological terms and the patriarchal power relation structuration in historical terms, so psychology and history together, set them up as victims. But when the daughters pick up their pens, the phallic scepter, in order to reclaim a place in the culture of the father by writing down their memories of the war and speaking for and to the mother, they finally reaffirm and reappropriate the maternal origination that is otherwise programmatically left unexplored and unproblematized. The authors I studied disrupt the Western patriarchal script that constantly aims at depriving women of their voice and, in case of genocide, of their lives as well. But it also disrupts the Jewish patriarchal script, and this is much less talked about because it irritates Jewish male historians, because the Jewish patriarchal script also puts women outside of the cultural realm that is supposed to be exclusive prerogative of men. So what about the title of my talk? Some of you might have recognized it, like, remember what Amalek did to you. I took this from David Roski's book, Against the Apocalypse, great book about the Holocaust, where he shares a story about going back to Israel, visiting one of his mother's friends, and he brings her a pen, a fountain pen, as a present. This woman's name is Regina, and Regina is the daughter of her father was a Talmud scholar, a rabbi, an ultra-Orthodox man, a Hasid in Bialystok before the war. But the daughter studied with Eisenstein in Moscow, and then she became the first professor of film studies in Israeli university. So she's a lapsed daughter of Israel. Yet the day he brought her the pen, she tested the pen just the way her father would have done before the war. She wrote the name Amalek and then crossed it out. So this little anecdote refers back to Deuteronomy in the Hebrew Bible, where God says, "Oh, remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heaven. Do not forget." This is God speaking. Its historical reference is another incident in the book of Exodus, in which Amalek had led his semi-nomadic tribe to do a very heinous massacre of an encampment of the Israelites at a moment when the Jews had actually left. So Amalek massacred all the women, the children, the old, and the infirms that were there. So he really became the symbol of utmost evil for the Jews. And I'm really fascinated by the idea that we must write his story in order to unwrite him from history, right? The act of writing that is so meaningful in the eternal Jewish quest for deciphering history is both capable of creation and its opposite. So this way, remembering for the Jews is established as the act of charging the perpetrators for their guilt while blotting out the qualities they embody, the unethical message their dreadful and murderous stories carry. Indeed, men have been, of course, the patrons of the written records of Jewish history throughout the millennia. However, particularly from the middle of the 20th century, women have really started writing en masse, particularly about the Holocaust, and they've contributed their viewpoints to the communal Jewish collective story. The Holocaust has been retold as devotedly by men and women alike. Legions of women have taken the place, stepped into the place of their disappeared fathers, brothers, or husbands, and assumed the responsibility of writing Jewish history, of remembering what Amalek did to them personally and collectively. But what have they written about when they remembered Amalek? They're impossible mothers, crazy mothers, mothering mothers, phallic mothers, but also rebellious mothers, loving mothers, fiercely protective mothers. These daughters' texts, in whose center there are only mothers, reveal how Jewish patriarchy at large, and anti-Semitism were all simultaneously at work in challenging and shaping the way in which women reacted to the imminent danger, as well as the way in which the maternal is experienced by Jewish girls and consequently represented later in their literature. In other words, what I'm implying is that blaming the Nazis is right, yet way too simplistic. By sustaining their focus on mothers and their personal and domestic stories, Jewish women writers foreground the fact that the Shoah did not happen in a vacuum. From a woman's perspective, I venture to say that being targeted as Jews by this genocide was one more expression, certainly the most extreme, of patriarchy's oppressive attitude toward them. Neither a recent invention nor one specific to the Nazis. Jewish women were oppressed as Jews and as women. The war happened within the patriarchal mindset of Europe, imperialistic, hegemonic, and controlling. Western patriarchal society marginalizes the voices of women, children, and those who do not fit the dominant categories. But let us not forget, likewise, that Jewish tradition and Judaism is part of this same sociocultural system. It has functioned in much the same way. In such a context, the varying degrees of a Jewish woman's religious orthodoxy, her assimilation into a given culture, her subordination or relative independence from certain power structure, could determine her chances of survival. For instance, Edith Brooke, whose mother was immediately gassed upon arrival at Auschwitz. She was 11 at the time, the daughter, Eddie Brooke. She shows a portrait of an utterly impotent mother whose blind religiosity and crippling poverty, together with her geographical isolation and lack of community support, worked in concert to prevent her escape. And Ruth Kluger, who survived the lager with her mother, remarked, politics, I'm quoting, was not meant to be a feminine domain, and in my mother's Czech finishing school, they didn't teach the girls how to read a newspaper critically any more than they instructed them on how to delouse the heads of children, end quote. So Auschwitz is framed by the writers I've worked on as one of the many products, undoubtedly the most monstrous one, of the oppression produced by male-dominated history, a history that often sacrifices women. The daughters I examine explicitly connect their mother's state of semi-permanent hysteria, paranoia, neurotic anxiety and fear for their children's safety to very concrete socio-historical roots, and these roots only pierce through the Shoah. They don't begin or end with it. So in my opinion, these unflattering descriptions of the victims' mothers as crazy, nagging, resentful, mean ballbusters also fulfill another fundamental function, one specific to this writer's position as women and daughters, that of remembering, together with Amalek, another famous ruler, Zeus. In fact, remember what Zeus did to you would probably be a better title for this lecture. And the work of Amber Jacob, actually I'm so indebted to it because she writes about a small little myth in Greek mythology that is absolutely, I had completely forgotten about it, of course, and it's the myth of Métis, M-E-T-I-S, and just to rehearse it for those of you who like me might have forgotten it, there's this little story in the gazillion stories of Greek mythology where Zeus lusts after this Titaness who's a very wise woman, and she has the capacity to transform, to morph into various shapes, and of course he does what Zeus does, he rapes her. And then after that he asks her, oh, why don't you show me your powers of transformation? She changes herself into a fly and Zeus swallows her whole, so that in the meantime she's pregnant and she's in his belly, and he is able to actually rule the Olympus, through her wisdom. And when it's time for her to deliver her baby, Zeus' head splits up in two, and now it comes Athena, perfectly formed and armored, and by the way, her shield and has been kind of knitted by Métis in the belly of Zeus. But anyway, and Métis disappears. We never hear of her again in Greek, in the Greek stories. And Zeus, who's absolutely enamored with his daughter, who of course she remains a virgin and childless, he calls her my brainchild, my motherless daughter. But she's not motherless. I mean, and she thinks she's motherless. We know she isn't. So anyway, so this story, so this is like the story I got from Amber Jacob's fantastic book, suddenly gave me a chance to find a structure and a language to understand the implicit act of rebellion that the art by so many Jewish daughters embodies and signifies. In other words, it is important that we begin to understand Auschwitz as not only a Jewish thing, one of the many historical expressions of Jewish tzores, right, bad luck. They bring attention to two parallel yet profoundly interconnected threads: the story of the Holocaust Jewish and the story of the unmourned loss of the mother, which is universal. They bring attention to the removal of the mother in the patriarchal, historical and socio-symbolic systems. If God the Father orders the Jews, always understood as male, to remember what Amalek did to them, the concealed mother compels the daughters to remember what Zeus did to them as well. Thus, the daughters I study resisted becoming part of patriarchy's symbolic concealments and affirmed themselves and their mothers as battling, complex, morphing characters who strategized their own survival despite the overwhelming forces of history, society, community, and family that worked to erase them. By acknowledging their matricidal drive in the retelling of their paths to adulthood, all the women I study implicitly acknowledge the absence of the mother in the cultural discourse to which they belong, a mother they're not equipped to represent other than in the process of killing her. The mother that the daughter is programmed to hate and separate herself from is a simulacrum, the external projection of a voiceless core concealed in the belly of the speaking father. Therefore, this daughter's creative acts attempt the impossible, or rather the forbidden, which is to introject the mother in order to mourn her, and mourning is the healthy response to loss in psychology. So remembering or surviving the Shoah becomes secondary to remembering or surviving the mother in the generative space of Jewish women's texts after 1968. Through remembering the vital navel imprisoned in the belly of the deadly violator, through focusing on the maternal connection, these artists, despite the pressures of male-dominated cultural discourse, set their origins in the generative soil of female genealogy rather than in the degenerate paternity of the Holocaust. Only in reconnecting with their mothers can they grasp the implications of what was done to them personally and communally, hold on to roots that were brutally severed, and bear witness to what defies the act of witnessing itself, the Shoah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Katie Stone, who is in her third year of the PhD program in German at the University of Cambridge. And the title of her talk this morning is History of Memory and Making Sense of Motherhood in 21st Century Germany. Tanja, Dückers, Himmelskörper,
Celestial Bodies. Yes. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. So my PhD actually talks about how female German authors, so I'm talking about perpetrator collective instead of German Jewish here, how authors from different generations reconstruct and gender the Nazi past. And something I'm particularly fascinated in, similar to, I think, is the endurance of certain stereotypes of female experience that make it very difficult to think about what National Socialism was in a way that accurately represents real women's experience, because too often, and still today really, figures of women as passive victims or simply historically passive are used to describe how German women participated in the Third Reich, which is obviously completely inaccurate in a lot of cases. So our focus on women's writing shows that the gender symbols enshrined in cultural memory importantly affect how individuals understand themselves, not just as gendered subjects, but as historical and political agents. Published in 2003, Tanja Dückers' novel, Celestial Bodies, is one of many recent German family narratives to revisit the Nazi past from a female perspective. The novel revolves around women from three generations: the first-person narrator Freya, who was born in approximately 1968, her mother Renate, and her grandmother Jo. For the narrator, deciphering and recording family history are also exercises in reassessing her relationship with her mother and making sense of her own impending motherhood. This paper will discuss the relationship between family memory and mothering as types of historical performance that rehearse and contest traditional gender norms. I will further argue that the focus on memory provides us with new ways of discussing hitherto overlooked but important relational aspects of the Butlerian concept of performativity. The floating gap between personal experiences of mothering and internalised quasi-institutional notions of motherhood is signalled at the outset of the novel. When Freya reflects on the impending birth of her first child, she muses that it feels surreal to think of Renate as her mother. I quote, "The image of a mother that I have in my head is somebody loud and overbearing, somebody that you are both dependent on and rebel against. Mother, that means a personified umbilical cord, but Renate was different." Lacking self-confidence, Renate does her utmost to divert attention away from herself. Consequently, Freya finds her mother somewhat boring. I quote again, "Quiet as she was, there was no friction between us, barely any contact. Sometimes I just overlooked her." In the course of her family project, Freya acknowledges that she too long accepted Renate's withdrawn nature as part of who she was. She and her brother had found it all too easy to act as if their mother had no emotions or life of her own. They expected her to be there for them, but never truly considered that the mother-child relationship could be reciprocal. Finding a way to foster reciprocity will be central to Freya's attempt to negotiate her own maternal identity. Freya realises that she will not be able to grasp her new maternal subjectivity without better comprehending her relationship to others and her place in history. As Freya thinks about the sort of relationship that she wants to have with her own child, she tries to make amends for the past by belatedly offering herself as a dialogue partner to her mother. The more that Freya learns about her family past, the more she realises that Renata had always struggled with the burden of guilt, particularly because her parents had fervently supported Hitler and never confronted their past. Moreover, their status as Nazis of the first hour had secured them the last places on a minesweeper when they had fled the approaching Red Army in 1945. They would otherwise have been forced aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was eventually torpedoed as it carried over 10,000 German refugees to safety in Western Germany. Their case had been helped when a 5-year-old Renata had denounced a neighbour's family for no longer performing the Hitler salute. Even though she was only an infant at the time, Renata never recovers from the knowledge that her actions had forced the other family to travel on the Gustloff and perish as a result. The narrator's reflections on motherhood are therefore closely related to her struggle to understand the transgenerational legacy of historical guilt. Freya feels as though her pregnancy has initiated a race against the clock, imposing a deadline on her search for answers to pressing questions about family history. She's burdened by the pressure to understand what sort of family she's bearing her child into. That involves understanding not only her grandparents' relation to National Socialism, but also the experiences that have conditioned family identities and relationships. Freya becomes acutely aware that being a mother means being part of history. She matures from a postmodern state of decentredness to a post-individual recognition of her rootedness in social and family structures. Once she falls pregnant, Freya suddenly recognises, and this is a quote again, "I was part of a long chain, a linkage, a construction that I had ultimately always found suspect. The thought flashed through my mind that I had already fallen out of line by becoming the first woman in our family to have a child out of wedlock, and to have studied." While Freya is now part of this genealogical chain of women as mothers, she represents an inflection point in this tradition. Born in 1968, the year of protest which triggered massive shifts in the social landscape of West Germany, Freya has benefited from a wealth of opportunities to which her mother and grandmother did not have access. She's doubly privileged, not just because of the opportunities open to her, but because she has the chance to negotiate her motherly identity in a manner that was not possible for previous generations. And since this sort of negotiation is related to her negotiation of the past, she has a new opportunity because before the past was silenced and she is now sort of in a different sort of memory landscape. So for Freya, negotiating her maternal identity will involve finding a way to combine her non-conformist attitude to life with mothering. Initially, this entails not buckling under social pressure to convert her maternal subjectivity into institutionalised notions of motherhood. She and her partner decide neither to marry nor to rush into living together. Despite her androgynous sense of style and her shaved haircut, Freya feels that she's distinguished most radically from her mother and grandmother by the choices that she makes relating to motherly identity. Such essentialist reflections on the centrality of motherhood to feminine identity stand out in a text that otherwise questions notions of heteronormativity. As Freya considers her pivotal role as mother in family tradition, she notes that only her homosexual twin brother, Paul, would be left behind, lonely and free. That was a quotation. The gender difference between herself and Paul that she had spent her childhood trying to fathom ultimately seems to come down to her ability to bear children, to her corporeal tie to tradition. Dückers here addresses an issue, the materiality of the maternal body, that is a source of discomfort for deconstructionist feminists. It's worth noting, however, that Dückers' emphasis on women as potential mothers does not mean that gendered identity is constrained by biology. Moreover, by placing considerations about motherhood within the framework of what it means to be a nodal point in historical and family traditions, Dückers moves beyond a reductive focus on the closed materiality of the maternal body to a consideration of the body's openness to others. This relationality is emphasised in Celestial Bodies through the centrality of mothers to the transmission of family memory. Women appear closely connected to history through their traditional roles as educators, caregivers, and storytellers. Freya describes knowing off by heart the story of the flight from Gotenhafen, which her grandmother, Jo, repeats almost ritualistically at family gatherings. In Celestial Bodies, the performative aspect of memory transcends purely verbal actions. The past is transmitted to female family members during the ritualistic process of hair plaiting. Just as Jo had plaited Renata's hair when she was a girl, Renata now plaits the hair of her children. This image of multiple generations of mothers plaiting their daughters' hair is a neat illustration of Nancy Chodrov's view that mothering practices impart and reinforce a model of female parenting. Mothering transmits a certain conception of woman in history and society. It teaches the practices that will allow this model of feminine identity to be internalised and reproduced by subsequent generations. In celestial bodies, the pigtails also represent what Judith Butler would term a corporeal sign of female gender. They impose on consequent generations a notion of female identity based on feminine appearance. In particular, the plaits symbolise a feminine ideal with roots in the Third Reich. This ideal is enacted in subsequent generations through the tradition of hair plaiting. And as Jo plaits her granddaughter's hair, she often tells stories about the happiest times of her life as a young girl in the Third Reich. The storytelling aspect of this tradition underlines the discursive element of maternal practices. In this instance, they take place in the traditionally defined parameters for female self-expression. Freya remembers that the plaiting sessions were some of the only occasions where her mother or grandmother would reveal their own feelings or talk about their pasts. As Freya grows older and rejects the sort of feminine identity transmitted by the pigtails, she therefore destabilises the female memory community. There is no longer a safe context for her mother or grandmother to tell their stories. The plaiting ritual is not only a socially embedded enactment of the gendering process, connected to a memory praxis encoded as feminine, it is also a renegotiation of family and collective history into identity. Dückers suggests that gender and memory are reciprocally related in the construction of historical meaning and identity. When Freya rejects the feminine identity that the plaits impose, cutting them off as a child and shaving her head as an adult, she also breaks with the Nazi past. And her brother affectionately nicknames her shaved hairstyle her BDM skinhead, which refers to their grandmother's participation in the BDM, the Nazi League of German Girls. Cutting off her hair, Freya refuses to internalise the traditional political notions of femininity imparted through maternal practices like the plaiting ritual. The repetition central to such practices of mothering and the feminine identities that they convey opens up the possibility to subvert the gender norms that they enable. The failure to repeat therefore exposes the arbitrary relation between the institution of motherhood and the maternal identities and acts that it reproduces. When Freya unexpectedly falls pregnant, she realises that it is not enough to superficially break with tradition, however. Subversive bodily acts might be possible where gender identity is concerned, but it's obviously not quite so easy to see how these acts might function in the context of mothering. One cannot simply fail to nurture or to educate a child. The theme of mothering in celestial bodies highlights other limits of Butler's theory. Firstly, for Freya, becoming a mother involves a conscious choice at the moment that she finds out she's pregnant. She'd never planned to marry or to have children. Her choice not to have an abortion is admittedly probably influenced to some extent by personal ethical ideals that are inseparable from culture. This choice nevertheless renders problematic Butler's claim that even the subject who would resist gender norms is itself enabled, if not produced, by such norms. Although this constitutive claim does not foreclose the possibility of agency, the account of agency conditioned by those very regimes of discourse and power cannot be conflated with voluntarism or individualism, she says. As a result of statements such as these, critics have charged Butler with disempowering agency. In the context of mothering, her claims seem to preclude any possibility of an emancipated, active, radical maternal subjectivity. And most relevant to my argument is Nancy Fraser's insistence that Butler's framework does not help us to theorise the relation of embodied individuals with their relatively enduring dispositions to the dispersed subject positions they successfully occupy. Nor are we given a means to theorise intersubjectivity, the relations to one another of such individuals. According to Fraser, Butler too quickly moves between the structural linguistic, psychoanalytic and institutional levels of her theory, without distinguishing or theorising the relation between them. Celestial bodies can help us to think about ways to overcome the individual dimensions of Butler's theory. Freya's reflections on mothering always occur within the framework of her remembrance. Recent feminist memory studies have emphasised the overlap between social constructivist theories of gender and of memory. Contemporary scholars consider both to be constructions and performative processes. Both doing gender and doing memory take place in existing cultural frameworks that are reinforced and contested in the process of repetition. One of the areas where these connections can be mutually productive involves the intersubjective aspects of doing memory and doing gender. Memory studies comprehensively theorise the relationship of symbolic structures to the social and political relations that inflect them. A discussion of maternal subjectivities that foregrounds the process of remembrance sheds light on forms of relational maternal identity that are not tied to the body or to the mother-child relationship. After all, Freya's reflections on mothering occur before she gives birth. The connection between mothering and memory in celestial bodies should make us think about the sort of reflexive processes that underlie maternal performativity. It's always from historical and social positions that an individual makes sense of themselves. Freya appreciates that carving out her own maternal subjectivity cannot just be about the discrete choices that she makes, whether that involves performing an androgynous identity or deciding not to have an abortion. Maternal subjectivity is, as Emily Jeremiah tells us, engaged in a relational process which is never complete and which demands reiteration. It also demands reflection and interaction in the family and in different social spheres. This becomes especially clear when we think about how mothering relates to personal history and tradition. In Celestial Bodies, Freya accepts that she's just one of the many thousand young women who had decided to do everything differently. Renata too had attempted to break with tradition. She had resolved, as a member of the so-called generation of 1968, to bring up her children in a non-authoritarian environment. For many Germans of Renata's generation, this also expressed a desire to reject their Nazi parents. The extent to which the family becomes the space where Renata works through her past is suggested by the middle name that she chooses for her son, Rudolf. And Rudolf was also the name of Renata's classmate whose family she had denounced when they fled Gottenhafen. Here again, Dückers suggests that mothering and remembering are intimately connected. Renata seeks to make amends for the past in the family. This recalls a 2010 article by Dückers published in the German newspaper Die Zeit. She asked whether the renewed aura surrounding family life can be related to the pervasive sense of unease provoked by the ongoing financial crisis and other sources of existential anguish. According to Dückers, people search in the family for a foothold in life and for strong emotional ties. They try to restore a lost sense of tradition and origin through the family. Overloading the family with meaning, however, can be risky, especially since family life is all too often defined by conflict. Having children should not be about the past and tradition, about making amends, but it should be about the future and about venture. Towards the end of Celestial Bodies, Freya acknowledges that she cannot hope to embrace her impending motherhood and gain a sense of personal maternal autonomy unless she tries to understand her relationship to the family past and to her mother. If she does not, unresolved conflicts will burden her motherly identity. The novel that we read is to be understood as Freya's creative work of reflection, of personal and of historical reckoning. The book of family memory that Freya produces initiates a belated dialogue with her mother, granting Renata a subjectivity that Freya had too long taken for granted. Committing this process of reflexivity to paper, however, the narrative also lays the groundwork for future reciprocal dialogue with her own daughter. To this extent, Dückers finds a way to break the hold of a tradition that objectifies maternal figures. The narrative fulfills the conditions of Marianne Hirsch's ideal mother-daughter plot, which should be written in the voice of the mother, as well as the voice of the daughter. The novel with which we are presented stages the sort of relational practices that are essential to aesthetic dialogue as to maternal practices and to remembrance. It makes us think carefully about the modes of relational identity that might enable us to re-empower maternal subjectivities. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Nathalie Ségeral, who is an assistant professor of French at the University of Hawaii, and who will be speaking on memory, post-memory, and motherhood in Linda Lay's Enfants que je n'aurai pas, To the Child I'll Never Have, and Cécile Wajsbrot's Mémorial.
Thank you. So, in my doctoral thesis, I have explored the figure of the infanticidal mother as a trope used by French and Francophone women writers who write about Holocaust, slavery, and madness traumas in order to reappropriate their story, which they feel has been silenced by the dominating male master discourse. So the trope of infanticide, by going against the usual idealized discourse held by male narratives of motherhood, being the last vestige of humanity in situations of extreme trauma, provides these women writers with a gendered discourse highlighting the sex subjectivity of their experience. Now, moving beyond this trope, I'm turning my attention to what seems to be a new trend among French women writers, the desire to remain childless and the need to write a kind of manifesto about it, which can appear paradoxical in a country that currently prides itself of one of the highest birth rates in Europe. I will endeavor to show that these manifestos for childlessness can also be read as attempts at reappropriating one's story and therefore at moving beyond victimology in the context of post-memory. So according to Marianne Hirsch and Adrienne Rich, all women participate in the concept of motherhood, the childless woman to the same extent as the mother, insofar as they are nonetheless defined in relation to motherhood. In this perspective, this new trend in French literature, that is to say, women writers reclaiming through literature the desire for childlessness, can be read as a way of inscribing new narratives of motherhood in the context of a society, the French society, which still heavily emphasizes motherhood as the ultimate fulfillment, even more so than in some other European countries for various reasons. So following Michael Rothberg's 2009 concept of multidirectional memory, which demonstrates how marginalized collective memories interact productively instead of competing with one another, this paper reads in conversation a French Jewish woman's autofiction about the Holocaust, Cécile Wajsbrot's Mémorial, which was published in 2005, and a Franco-Vietnamese woman writing about mental illness, childhood abuse and immigration, Linda Lê, À l'enfant que je n'aurai pas, To the Child I Will Not Have, which was published in 2011. So my argument is that these two authors both use the trope of childlessness so as to reject a certain traumatic history, which also enables them to challenge their positions as reified subjects of male historical, psychoanalytical narratives, and to reappropriate their story and claim a new position in the literary canon. So the justification for bringing these two themes, the Holocaust and immigration, together is, despite appearances, quite strong. The common point among these two authors lies in their double exclusion as women and as dominated subjects in history. So the common trope of childlessness to which they resort can be seen as constituting a new voice of women's writings, dealing with this sex subjectivity of trauma and challenging accepted notions of gender. The figure of the childless mother and the blurring of gender categories and lineages are omnipresent in both narratives. Furthermore, Linda Lê and Cécile Wajsbrot both challenge the expected notion of uprootedness. At the heart of narratives of exile and immigration, recently developed in the context of feminist studies by Marianne Hirsch and Nancy Miller in Rights of Return, Diaspora Poetics and the Politics of Memory. To the contrary, Wajsbrot and Lé's narratives emphasize the rejection of origins and thus the rejection of a melancholy longing for romanticized roots. The origin, Poland in Cécile Wajsbrot's case and Vietnam in Linda Lé's case, is instead violently rejected, which leads to a rejection of the mother figure as the bearer and symbol of this despised origin. So in a 2010 interview to Télérama, Linda Lê declared that je me sens presque toujours en exil dans la France d'aujourd'hui. Je crois que même si je vis en France depuis longtemps, je ne me suis jamais dit là est mon pays. Mais je ne me dis pas non plus que le Vietnam est mon pays. Je porte à la langue française un amour profond, c'est mon seul point d'ancrage dans une réalité que je continue de trouver très violente. So my translation is, sorry if the translation is not great, but I did my best. I almost always feel exiled in today's France. I even think that even though I have been living in France for a long time, I have never said to myself, here is my country. But I don't say either that Vietnam is my country. I love the French language deeply. It is my only anchoring point in a reality that I still find very violent. So besides being both autofictions, À l'enfant que je n'aurai pas and Mémorial share many similarities. Linda Lê was born in 1963 in North Vietnam. In 1969, her family moved to Saigon to escape the war. Then in 1977, she moved to France with her mother and 3 sisters. Cécile Wajsbrot is a Jewish French woman of Polish origins who was born in Paris in 1954 and now divides up her time between Paris and Berlin. Her parents and grandparents left Poland in 1946 after the Holocaust. So her parents and grandparents somehow survived the Holocaust, but in 1946, in their town of Kielce, there was a pogrom in which the father's elder brother was killed, and that's when they decided to leave Poland. Both writers contribute to a redefinition of the concept of motherhood by questioning its founding principles and by feeling the need to justify their choice of not reproducing, or, to quote Cécile Wajsbrot, to be libre de toute descendance, free from descendants. This choice is in both texts complicated by issues of memory and post-memory. According to Marianne Hirsch, post-memory consists in the transgenerational transmission of Holocaust trauma and generally occurs through the mother-daughter relationship, which is characterized by a greater affective proximity than that between a mother and a son. In Wajsbrot only, rejection of motherhood underscores a rejection of their own mother figures, which, as the text unfolds, amounts to a crisis of memory, of origins, and a rejection of the original trauma. Thus, rejection of motherhood becomes a refusal of transmission. This paper proposes to explore the specific tropes used in those 2 texts as a means to re-engendering memories through a crisis of motherhood in literature. So I will look at the 2 main facets of this rejection of the mother figure. First, the rejection of the mother herself, then through a childlessness manifesto or a non-motherhood manifesto. So I will study images of tormented filiation in both texts, and then the trope of the voluntary childlessness as a paradoxical rejection of memory, post-memory, and the weight of the past, and a certain form of femininity. So first, tormented motherhood. So, as we have just seen, Wajsbrot's Mémorial is an autofiction, and the narrators, grandparents and parents, survived the Holocaust and moved from Poland to France after the father's eldest brother was killed. So Cécile Wajsbrot is what is termed a female Jewish writer of the after generation. So she didn't experience the Holocaust herself. Her autofiction revolves around the expression of the memory of the Holocaust that she has inherited from her parents and grandparents. Mémorial recounts a trip that the narrator, who lives in Paris, she's in her early 50s, she decided to take a trip back to her origins, I'm quoting her, back to her origins in Poland, so as to see the place where her parents grew up and about which she has heard so much. So the landscape and chronology of trauma are generally conveyed through a suspension of time and the metaphor of an in-between world. The space of the concentration camp, and by extension of trauma, is depicted as spectral on several levels. So when she goes to Kielce, she meets the ghost of her father's dead brother, and he's still 13, which was the age he was when he was killed. And then there is a dialogue between the narrator and the ghost. So let me first briefly explain what post-memory is. So even though Hirsch coined this term in the context of Holocaust trauma, my research is extending it to other traumas. So the concept of post-memory aims at describing the dilemmas of memory and identity experienced by children of survivors of trauma. In her 1996 article entitled Past Lives, Post-Memories in Exile, Hirsch explains, I quote, "Children of survivors live at a further temporal and spatial remove from the decimated world of their parents. Post-memory characterizes the experience of those who grew up dominated by narratives that preceded their birth, whose own belated stories are evacuated by the stories of the previous generation, shaped by traumatic events that can be neither fully understood nor recreated." End of quote. So, the way Marianne Hirsch developed her theory of post-memory, sorry, I have a bit of a cold. My accent is not that bad usually, but... So she examined, she interviewed a lot of psychoanalysts and psychologists who work with children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and she quotes a lot of examples, and one of them is this young woman in New York City who had eczema on her forearm, and she couldn't get rid of it. And during psychoanalysis, it came up that where she had the eczema was exactly where her parents had the tattoo from Auschwitz, but they never talked about it. So the silence had actually made her sick, but so she had inherited this trauma through silence, even though they never talked about it, she was traumatized. So Cécile Wajsbrot's novel, Mémorial, revolves around this very theme, the theme of post-memory, as can be seen through obsessive motifs of entrapment and the metaphors of stifling and drowning. So here she describes the position of the children of survivors as a kind of in-betweenness, trapped between knowing and not knowing, fully understanding and not understanding, which is echoed in the first lines of Mémorial, as the narrator evokes her ambivalent state of mind at the beginning of her journey. Voulant, comme souvent, à la fois partir et ne pas partir, découvrir et ne pas découvrir, et surtout savoir et ne pas savoir. So, as always, I wanted to know and not to know, to live and not to live, to discover and not to discover. So the ghost of the dead brother is actually the narrator's uncle, but she never calls him her uncle, she keeps calling him the brother. Emphasizes the perverted family relationships and the blurring of generations brought about by post-memory. And then, so at the end of her trip, the narrator, she feels better actually. She says, now I know why I have decided to be childless, and I feel that I am free of all ascendants and free of all descendants. So, but it's ambivalent because it's not really, she feels relieved, but at the same time she keeps saying the very notion of family is poisoned. So it's a bit, it's an ambivalent remark. So the very notion of family is poisoned, and yet she has found the purpose of her quest, which is the father's dead brother. But this exemplifies the destructive effect of the Holocaust on the survivor's genealogy through this inherited trauma. So her so her father's brother with her uncle was drowned, and this physical drowning is paralleled by her feeling of psychological drowning under the weight of post-memory. She says, as a consequence of this stifling silence, I was trying to escape from drowning, from these deep waters which were about to drown me. Then the narrative, so pondering at the end of the narrative, she goes back to Paris and she says, oh, now I feel so much better, and I've decided I will never have children because I don't want to run the risk of traumatizing my own children the way I have been traumatized by my parents. But then she discovers that her parents have been, actually her mother is dead, so it's her father and the father's sister, her aunt, which she also calls the sister, not my aunt. So suddenly they are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So she's pondering over this tragic irony that her father and her aunt have now Alzheimer's disease, so she becomes the last person to remember what she doesn't want to remember. So again, for the second time, she states that the very notion of family is poisoned. So after poisoning her life with the burden of their past, her family now enjoys what she sees as blissful oblivion, and she is left alone as the sole repository of the family traumatic memory. So reflecting upon her childhood in the swamp of post-memory, she implies that she has been memorialized. As a child, she felt used as a living memorial by her father and her aunt's endless stories about the past in Poland. So the brother theme is also omnipresent in Lindale, we see it in other French writers' brothers in literature. In her letter, À l'enfant que je n'aurai pas, so it's a manifesto that takes the form of a letter addressed by the narrator to you, the child I never have. And it reads as a manifesto for childlessness, in which she thoroughly exposes her arguments for remaining childless. However, Upon reading the letter, it quickly becomes obvious that another main underlying theme is that of the traumatic and abusive relationship that Leigh had with her mother, whom she calls Big Mother. She remembers how oppressed she used to feel by her high expectations as to what femininity must be when she was not downright physically and psychologically abused. The trauma and the fear were such that she writes, I quote, "It is only in my 30s that I was able to somewhat overcome the terror she inspired me." Talking about her teenage years, she writes, already back then, I was making promises to myself to never become a mother, so as not to pass over to my children the upbringing I had suffered from. My sisters thought they could conjure up the determinism of repetition, but unlike them, I was afraid to reproduce authority mechanisms. In her reflection on post-memory, Hirsch emphasizes this mother-daughter transmission of trauma as a consequence of the usual greater emotional and physical closeness that exists between a mother and her daughter. So, building on Adrienne Rich's statement that the mother-daughter story is a great unwritten story, Hirsch sets out to rewrite this mother-daughter plot. In a kind of parody, Linda Leigh and Cécile Wajsbrot seem to be moving beyond Hirsch by implying that this mother-daughter plot is actually poisoned, I'm quoting Wajsbrot, in that it only brings about suffering. Therefore, that this unwritten story had rather remained silenced, and the best way to silence it is by not reproducing, not engaging in motherhood. Interestingly, in Mémorial, trauma is actually transmitted by the father and the paternal aunt. The mother is an absent figure. The reader is just told that she died when the narrator was very young. So, now I'm moving to my second and last party, the childlessness as rejection of post-memory. Towards the end of her journey, Mémorial's narrator writes, "Je me retrouvais libre, libre de toute lignée à construire, libre de toute lignée à détruire. I was finally free, free from any lineage to build, free from any lineage to destroy." Thus, Mémorial, whose construction bears many similarities with the fairy tale genre, eventually reads as a reverse fairy tale, in which the narrator, instead of coming of age by getting married and having children as most fairy tales have it, experiences her childlessness as liberating at the end of her journey. Her journey back to the underworld of the traumatic origins has proved cathartic insofar as she can now embrace her childlessness as the long-awaited freedom from the poison of memory. So the juxtaposed phrases, no lineage to build, no lineage to destroy, highlight that for the narrator, becoming a mother is closely linked to destruction, the omnipresent risk of destroying her children's lives by transmitting the burden of her own trauma. So Linda Leigh seems to echo Cécile Wajsbrot when she addresses her imagined unborn son as follows. "Tu m'as aidé à me transcender. You have helped me transcend myself." Thus, traditional roles are reversed, and by being in a way sacrificed, the child she did not have enabled her to transcend herself and to be reborn. We have here one of the main differences between Wajsbrot's text and Leigh's. Namely, À l'enfant que je n'aurai pas is centered on this you, the child who will never be born, which is thus cast as a sacrificial figure, allowing catharsis for his mother, much like narrative such as Toni Morrison's Beloved and Marius Condé's Moi Tituba, sorcière noire de Salem. In a way, Leigh's letter is presented as a new form of infanticide, insofar as by sacrificing this unborn child, whose entire life she has already imagined, she can free herself and transcend herself. She even writes, I was rather fascinated by Electra, the vengeful daughter, and by Medea, the infanticidal mother. The written word fleshes out the child, whereas in Mémorial, the child is never evoked, since the narrator still considers herself as a daughter whose brother is her dead uncle. While Leigh claims, je serai toujours la fille, libre d'entrave et non la mère aux multiples obligations, un individu qui se respecte ne se glorifie ni de son ascendance ni de sa descendance. So I will forever be a daughter, free from all constraints, and never a mother with her many obligations. However, this letter to her unborn child actually enacts her non-motherhood by paradoxically positioning her as a mother despite her desire to remain the eternal daughter. However, both authors also emphasize the difficulty for a woman in positioning herself in a society that so highly values motherhood and constantly pressures women into reproduction. Lé calls her childlessness mon insoumission à la loi de la reproduction, my rebellion against the law of reproduction, and goes on to draw a parallel between atheism and childlessness in a society in which motherhood has been erected to the rank of religious dogma. So Linda Lé recounts also that she attempted suicide at some point and subsequently stayed in Sainte-Anne, which is a famous psychiatric hospital in Paris. She was told that her personality would improve once she'd become a mother, that she would no longer feel depressed. So seemingly answering and challenging Béatrice Didier's seminal work, L'écriture femme, on the relationship between literary creation and giving birth, Lé declares that giving birth to a work of fiction does not equate giving birth to life. For Béatrice Didier, the French feminist, literary creation equates procreation, but not for Lé, which further complicates her voluntary childlessness. So in conclusion, in 2009, Michael Rothberg already denounced the ethical issue of the child figure being placed at the center of the current discourses on trauma and memory by analyzing Michael Haneke's film Caché, dealing with the transmission of the trauma of the Algerian War. So Linda Lé and Cécile Wajsbrot's text can be read as counterpoints to that issue. In Wajsbrot and Lé, rejection of motherhood underscores a rejection of their own mother figures, which, as the text unfolds, amounts to a crisis of memory, of origins, and rejection of trauma. Thus, rejection of motherhood becomes a refusal of transmission. Childlessness and its vindication becomes a trope used in these two texts as a means to re-engendering memories through a crisis of motherhood, whereby the child becomes a metaphor of memory and trauma. As Mémorial unfolds, it becomes obvious that it is everything but a memorial. The only memorial is a child figure for both authors, whereby Postmemory affects family relationships to such an extent that the child is no longer perceived as representing the future and a new beginning, but becomes a bearer of the traumatic past and a living memorial through which the mother risks perpetuating her own trauma. Thank you.
Thank you to all three speakers for very inspiring comments and very interesting papers and for staying so well within the time limits. That was wonderful. I open the floor to questions and comments and responses of any sort. Yes?
I've got two questions. Sorry, I hope that's okay. One is for Federica.
Yes.
Just a really quick one. I mean, it struck me when you were saying about this sort of lack of the mother in the Holocaust story, that people were segregated. So they weren't, the men who write their Holocaust stories were separated from the women. So, I mean, does that let them off the hook to some extent? I was trying to think of whether there was a sort of similar lack of men in women's Holocaust stories, and I'm too ignorant to really know, but certainly if you know, from what I have read of the women's Holocaust stories, which is not that much, there's a similar lack of men, because but what I've read has been focused on the events during the Holocaust, so maybe that's the difference.
It's a good question. It's what happens is, of course, men are, well, in the literature of daughters, men are less present. I mean, they're present, but they're present in a different way. I mean, fathers, it's such an incredible coincidence. Most women I deal with, they actually, their fathers all died. I mean, really, the famous father that survived is Anne Frank's father. All other fathers actually died, at least in the women. So the authors I deal with usually the fathers had already escaped because men were the first to flee, thinking, oh, no one is going to harm women and children. And all they had been already deported or killed, and then of course in the camps there was the major split, women and children on one side. So yes, so men and fathers are less present. But again, we're talking about children, and when their fathers are present, in the case of Brooke, for instance, which is an amazing memoir, she's so famous for writing this incredible, very feminist. She's a professor of German literature, so she's really building her text very, very well. And the father is present, for instance, but she attacks the father too. This kind of, and sometimes, as in the case of many of the kinder transport children that came to England, they remember that, for instance, in their very traditional families, still the mothers put their foot down and said, we have to let the child go, while the fathers were more reluctant, because they just could not let go of their patriarchal, how do you, basically it's admitting you fail, right? It's like, okay, I have to give my child to someone else. But the mothers were really they were hysterical. I mean, women were hysterical, were accused of being hysterical. Well, oh, you're just exaggerating. And in fact, as it turns out, they had a point. So anyway, so there was this very strange dynamic. So the fathers seemed to kind of, yes, disappear a little bit more, but because they were so impotent, it was so unusual for fathers. They found themselves in a very unusual situation, very feminized situation. All of a sudden they were in the domestic area, they didn't work anymore, they didn't win bread anymore, they were defenseless, they could not protect their families. So all of a sudden, a situation that was very familiar to women, and so they kind of emerged in it very strongly, it was in fact very unfamiliar to men. They found themselves in very uncharted, waters. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but there are fathers in this literature. But you're right, usually they're a little bit more on the side.
Thank you. Can I ask my other question? Sorry to call him greedy. It's for the last speaker. It struck me that when you were talking about this childlessness as a response to trauma that has happened to the parents of the adult child in question. I can imagine that a lot of people would see that as a pathology in itself, and that then it could become part of this part of the trauma. Is that how you see it, and is that how the authors that you were talking about see it, and do you see that as a potential problem?
Well, that's a tricky thing, because if you see childlessness as a pathology, but I totally see what you mean, and actually those two authors anticipate that. It's as if she were answering a potential, as if she were in front of a jury and justifying clearly why she had decided to remain childless. And she is aware that initially she was so scared of reproducing this bad mothering. But then she tries to develop her own arguments as to why this is the right choice for her. But then if we say that remaining childless is a pathology, it's still in relationship to this normative femininity that a woman can only be fulfilled through motherhood.
Well, I guess my point is that because it's very specific what you're talking about, that it's with reference to these traumatic pasts, that makes it more likely to be judged as a pathology in those cases.
Yeah, I understand. Because my research is about trauma narratives, so that I focused on that. No, I would have to look for, maybe there are some equivalent, some other women writers in France who didn't experience any trauma and still decided to write something about remaining childless. I have to look at that now.
I think just to add to what Nathalie saying, I think in other parts of the text, she talks a lot about the relationship with her decision in writing. So there are other reasons, and it's a very reasoned, rationalised, she's really gone through the argument, and it's not just all about the bad relationship with her mother and trauma. It's about her and her identity as a writer and her desire to write, and that being more primary for her than the justice. So her, the fact that she does link these other aspects to justification would argue against it.
Yes. This is a question to Federica, and you're also thank you very much. And I wanted to ask whether this notion of patriarchy, that you said is relevant to the way his daughter framed the relationship with the mothers during the Shoah. Does it echo the two discourses that feminized also Jewish men before the Holocaust, and I mean the Nazi discourse, but also Zionist discourse, which for the memoirs that were written in Israel, somehow perhaps some of them echo the hierarchy that Zionism created between the old Jew, the new Jew, and this sort of gendered reading of patriarchy. Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's kind of really the problem in a way. I mean, it was one of the many problems. Is the idea that so here's the thing. Well, for instance, actually, just talking about the bad Jew, the weak Jew, right? That is the problem to me, is that we always think of the Holocaust as something that started, ended, it's this real freaky event in history. It's really, if we zoom out and look at the long haul, it makes sense. It makes perfect. And you see that after the Holocaust, when these girls survive the unthinkable, losing their parents and sometimes their mothers and so on, and then they go back to absolutely the same society as it was in the pre-war era. I mean, it's just a society. We never think about it, but really, society had not changed much. Even in America, I mean, there was the domestic thing of women, the idea of strong men versus weak men, and Bettelheim himself. I mean, he hated Otto Frank because he was the epitome of the weak European Jew that was unable to help his family. He didn't escape. And yes, and of course in Israel, the idea of the all-world Jews that and so these writers after 68 are all feminists, and they're dealing with this incredibly difficult conundrum. On the one hand, they don't want to idealize the victims. On the other hand, in that kind of feminist way of attacking patriarchy, attacking the father with capital F. And this is the problem with Sarah Kaufmann in particular. It's, she finds herself, she knows the problem is the father, the big father. But then, how do you kill the father when your actual historical father has been a victim as well, has been murdered too? And this is really, I don't have an answer. I mean, it's a conundrum. You see them fighting, because the same thing with the mother. You kill the mother, the patriarchal mother, the phallic mother, but then how do you salvage the mother that actually saved your life, or the mother victim? So it's really, it's heart-wrenching, but it's so phenomenal, the work, because they don't simplify the way older writers have, like Wiesel and so on. They actually just, they try to actually at least talk about this terrible, terrible riddle that they can't unpack. But, I don't know what the discourse is now in Israel, but it used to be quite mean, of course, quite incredible. I mean, for the big, it's feminized and masculinized Jewish men the way in which, as you said, Nazi propaganda or fascist propaganda had done for 8 years, about 19 years in Europe before the war. So.
Can I just come back to the question just before? I just remember something. It's a good point that you raised, because actually a lot of Holocaust narratives highlight the fact that they absolutely want to have as many children as possible in order to make up for the trauma. But in that case, we're not going to say, oh, that's pathological, because it's a reaction to trauma. So why would childlessness be seen as pathological? You see what I mean?
Yeah, but it reveals a lot of underlying assumptions, which aspects of it you do see as pathological.
Well, I mean, it's not pathological, because then they make it into a conscious choice, a conscious decision, and this is why they decided to have children. So when somebody decides to have lots of children to make up for traumatic events, people don't ask great justification.
We have a question here and then here.
Is that okay? Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I think it's probably worth saying this is a really troubling panel because we're talking about matricide and we're talking about persistent and ongoing sort of aspects of matricide in different ways, in really interesting different ways. And I suppose, I mean, just a couple of points. So one, thinking about Andrew Jacobs' work, you know, is it an adequate response to a reading of Western culture as matricidal, to think about reinstating the law of the mother as a generative law, which is what she tries to do to sort of counterbalance the paternal generative law in psychoanalytic. So does that help us? Or does even the idea of reinstating certain kinds of laws, by definition, a form of violence? So that's one question. And then I suppose thinking about that kind of Hegelian tradition of thinking about how one might expand the symbolic that would include a feminine maternal in a non-matricidal way. So that you know, we are not, as human subjects, defined by a necessary need to object to the maternal. How might we continue that project? And one, I suppose, way forward recently has been Rebecca Ettinger's work on that already made mother monster. You know, the idea that actually perhaps there are primal fantasies in her terms, psychoanalytic terms, might have problems with that, but that perhaps there's a ready-made receptacle, if you like, for certain kind of matricidal fantasies that can't and shouldn't be mapped onto empirical situations, yeah, in a kind of direct way. So, from what I read of the kind of literature that you're discussing, there's lots of room for that slippage between the fantasy of a matricidal and all-engulfing mother and abandoning mother, the classic tropes that we are so supposedly angry with our mothers about as daughters, the mother who doesn't process trauma adequately and therefore leaves the next generation in silence. It sounds like the literature you're dealing with sort of makes the slippage between that as a fantasy, yeah, and that is an empirical reality through which people are working through historical fact. And I just kind of worry about that elision, and that perhaps we need to make a bit better use of the idea of matricidal fantasy as an aspect of culture, rather than simply reading your authors in an empirical sense. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a kind of, it's a comment, I mean, it'd be interesting. If you just line out.
There's an enthusiastic kind. Is this a follow-up to Ines?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please. Because I disagree with her. And what I think is to be honest and to look at the empirical mothers. I mean, I think what I understood from you, Federica, is that it's some sort of a relation to the myth of motherhood as well. I mean, it's not just because they're feminists and they're writing later. I mean, they are questioning things about, I mean, if you are in a catastrophe, in a situation of catastrophe, does it make you necessarily a good enough mother? Or you can be like, you know, empirical mother and you can still discuss it. I mean, despite the Holocaust, you can still discuss reality. And maybe this is what these women are doing. And because we are so, maybe as an Israeli, it's easier for me to look at the Holocaust in a more like ambivalent way, because it's my story, okay? But when looking at it, do you understand what I'm, it's my story in the sense of like, I was brought on knowing and living the Holocaust. I know that it's much more, I mean, the stories, the personal stories inside this historical story are much more complicated, and I can relate to that, you know, being some kind of rebel inside the Zionist, you know, Israeli story of the Holocaust. So I can say that these stories are probably empirical stories. Why to use the fantasy? I mean, why not believe this woman that this is the mother they experience and just live with it and look and say the Holocaust didn't change women nature or male nature. It just, this is what it is, you know. So
sorry, I wasn't in any way suggesting that you didn't listen to me from one of the stories in Amalek.
No, you say that you need the fantasy construct.
No, I'm saying that the capacity towards matricidal fantasy that we need to really watch out for.
This is where we part.
But isn't part of the process of fantasizing, working through, we sort of need sometimes those matricidal fantasies so that we don't touch our mother. And that we can sort of confront and deal with. I mean, today is very clear about the fact that writing about suicide, the suicidal mother, death, putting the death of the mother figure into, it's not matricidal, but it is an abjection of a maternal figure, if you like. And that is very liberating. Someone else was talking to me this morning about writing about a mother dying, and that's very freeing. So, we use literature to deal with reality and with contradictions and conflicts, and that's healthy. Not, I would suggest.
Anything to say about health and in health in relation to any of
We had another question here. I want to make sure you look. This is just a side from this little discussion. I thank you for the analysis, because they were certainly then complex. And I would just like to remember one work in that context of Federica's argument about the Jewish mothers unwritten from the Jewish history, and actually their argument about the difficulties of the daughters to rewrite them into history. It's a very exceptional work by an American Jewish writer, Helen Epstein. That's titled "Where She Came From." And actually, I remember it also because of the earlier presentation of yours. Because it's a sort of intentional experimentation with the genre. She calls it a feminist memoir, and she is a woman living in the States whose family history goes into the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and she decides to retrace the family history in fact matrilineal history, and she traces the history of her mother, who was a survivor of Holocaust, and goes back to her grandmother and great-grandmother in Austria-Hungary, and it's an example of a work that actually is intentionally and very successfully opposing this what seems sort of paradigm after what you explained. So maybe there are signs that the daughters are able to rewrite mothers into history very affectionately.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. By the way, the book is great, and particularly in the portrayal of the male side of the family, like the grandfather who converts everybody, like wants to speaks German and puts down the women, her grandfather, great-grandfather. Anyway, so I love the book, it's phenomenal. But to go back to your question, I'm not sure I might be misinterpreting what you were, because I think it's an interesting, it's a question, I think you're asking like, where does psychology and history is supposed to be? You're saying, in other words, to keep the two realms separately, which is the pragmatic life, and then there is the internal. Is that what you were trying to say? Like there's kind of a psychological drive, and that does not necessarily translate into the historical. Is that what you were?
No, I'm trying to get at, I think, what your work is trying to get at, which is how do we understand the persistence of, in your terms, a kind of patriarchy. I suppose I would extend that to be a kind of social symbolic link which relies on the exclusion of the maternal feminine as constitutive of the symbolic. That's part of what that tradition of feminist thought that is trying to expand the imaginary might be about. And I'm saying Well, if that is something, you know, it can't just be reverted necessarily by reclaiming women's voices, because there's a problem, isn't there, about how those voices show up in an ongoing patriarchal structure. So then something else has to change. It isn't just about listening differently or putting mothers back in. And might need to be about trying to understand what, I'm not talking about psychological necessarily, but sort of socio-psychological structures, that is those kind of social fantasies of the ready-made mother monster. Yeah, how one might really try to get at those structures, rather than thinking one can get at them by just continually trying to write the mother back into history, which actually seems like she falls out every time.
I actually think it's impossible. Honestly, I mean, because it's like the story of Matisse. It's everything. She speaks through the father's voice. I mean, the moment we try to rebel, we do it within that fold and we recreate. I mean, in language itself, I mean, it's just like, it's the Foucault thing. You cannot fight from, we can't just project ourselves out of the system. We are the system, and we are it, we are in it, and so I don't think, but I think that what is possible is this concept like the drop, like the stone against the wall, and here there is a little opening and then it closes again, and then another opening. So I think that's kind of maybe what's happening in terms of feminist work. There's constant kind of scraping, no matter what. But for these girls in particular, Sarah Kaufmann didn't have children and killed herself in '94. It's this idea that, I mean, really, if you think the canon, the canon of, it's, at least in North America, and I guess in part of Western Europe too, the school curricula, it's Primo Levi, Tadeusz Borowski, Elie Wiesel, and now Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and of course the must-see film is Schindler's List. And the way in which Frank is put in there is actually incredibly problematic. I mean, it's not because she's a woman, in fact, not at all. It's also the way in which she's misused. But and really in those books, I saw it through teaching this over and over at the beginning of my career. I was teaching, and then I realized students don't get any idea. It's as if all of us, one day you wake up and there is Auschwitz, and then one day finally there's the light at the end of the tunnel, and sort of. And what about the women, right? The mothers, and particularly when I started reading, women memoirs about it, what struck me is that not only they talk about mothers, but really unpleasant mothers. I mean, the craziness of the mother, of the Jewish mother in particular, the neurosis, and actually it's kind of, which at some point during the war, it's as if the insanity of the inside was perfectly matched by the insanity of the outside. So all of a sudden, actually, they made sense with these doses. But the strange thing is that even during the Holocaust, which again, it's not even because it's a very understandable phenomenon in history, it's very clear that the daughters were still, I mean, you really see the overpowering and the violence and the brutality of patriarchy, certain patriarchal mindframe, act upon women so clearly in the case of genocide. How, even during, in the midst of this chaos and this mess, women were still not supposed to do certain things, like even to go and get themselves a visa on their own, because men do that. It's that the public arena was still closed to it. It's this insane thing, and so the mothers fighting with daughters about the most banal everyday things because they're absolutely made crazy by the system, by the world they live in. So this daughter's having this resentment, this hate towards her mother. Kluger saying, "My mother is terrible for me. She's bad news. She doesn't love me." The moment they get to the concentration camp, the mother tells her daughter, "Let's jump into the electric fence," and the daughter's having intention. She's 10, whatever, and she wants to live. But it's kind of, so my mother is not good for me, she doesn't have a good idea, and then they start fighting. There is a selection for the gas, and the mother passes the selection, the daughter doesn't, and the mother insists that the daughter goes back in line and tries again. They won't remember you, just do it again. They start fighting, bickering. The middle, it's unreal.
And, you know, you don't love me, I know you don't love me, you don't listen to me, I was more quick, you know, oh, you want me to die, I got a heart attack, you have to give me an answer. So the daughter goes, and then, thank goodness, you know, she's safe. But at the same time, it's this incredible, so it's madness, it's you know, these mothers are like a stereotype in a way, but these daughters are not ashamed of them. They say, well, it works, actually. There is a reason why they're this way, and it might be a good thing to look back at this example, rather than just to be ashamed and just portray, you know, that, the mother singing, and you just saw cooking chole as well, you know, like in Elise Zell's case. So, but yeah, unfortunately, I think there is no way, sadly. And maybe your daughters were. I chose not to have children because I was like growing up in Europe. I was like, that's enough. No, that's it. Your dance. So very traumatized to childhood.
I was just actually wanting to go back to what you said. I do agree to a certain extent. I do find something a little bit problematic that there's constantly this focus on women in this text, and the female genealogy and why. And I always find it peculiar that the novel I talk about, the father's completely, well, she's always a daddy's girl when she grows up, and then she realises she's forgotten her mother, and then she forgets the father in the novel, and it's just a vicious circle, because she then gets to the age of 60 when the father's died and go, oh, I don't know anything about his story either, and then I don't know, I found it quite interesting reading this book, because it made me think about, you know, being still pretty young, but I've been very selfish about my parents for a very long time and forgotten that they're real people. And so you go, oh gosh, I know absolutely nothing about them. But you can't just focus on one and not focus on the other. You know, I do find it problematic that it seems that there aren't very many books that try to do both.
I mean, I think it's wonderful that you know, which generation or age or whatever, older personally. Because I think, you know, there's what the focus on women does is try to redress an imbalance. And of course, in redressing or addressing an imbalance is potentially creating another imbalance, which, you know, at some point, hopefully the scales will tip relatively, and it's wonderful that you feel like that, and that's your response, because that's healthy. That shows that there's perhaps being enough emphasis or being an adequate redressing or addressing, so that we can start to sort of discuss both, if you like, or include both sides.
I think it just shows how destructive this constant focus on mothers and fathers, rather than thinking about the similarities, you know, trying to find ways of thinking about things in less binary terms, because I think that's the only way to move forward in a lot of ways.
Thank you all so much for your comments and participation.